spend some time with Pat Buchanan. He's got a book out, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. And I do believe Pat is the first guest that we've had where one of us has a photo of the guest sitting right next to him here in the studio. That would be Scott and his photo of Pat. Pat, good morning to you.
How are you?
We're well. How are you doing?
Doing just fine this morning.
Hit him with the photo.
Yeah, I gotta give you a thank you before we start, Pat, for 17 years in the making. When I was a high school senior, we had an assignment in my creative writing class. We had to write somebody famous and ask for an autographed picture in return. And so I chose Pat Buchanan. Wrote you a letter, said, a big fan, read your books, supporter of the campaigns. Could I get an autographed picture? And perhaps could you also send one for my really liberal history teacher, Mr. Nagus? And so a few weeks later, what arrived in the mail, but what I have now, the framed signed picture from Pat Buchanan to my friend and supporter in the campaigns of 92 and 96, Scott Bertram. All the best, Pat Buchanan, November 1997. And you also sent along one that said, to Scott Bertram's liberal history teacher, Mr. Nagus, all the best, Pat Buchanan, which he had, the last time I was in his classroom, still had hanging on the wall. So, thank you.
Well, delighted to have done it, quite frankly.
I know what you're thinking. Hey, couldn't this kid have sent me a thank you note a few years ago?
Converted at all?
I'm sorry?
You got him converted at all?
No, unfortunately. He was long past time.
Right.
But we tried. My friend and I in class, we tried the best we could, but unfortunately, not able to convince. Oh, well. Great new book, The Greatest Comeback. I want to obviously talk about that in a moment, but I can't ignore what's happening in the world. What an amazing day of history yesterday. The plane shot down in eastern Ukraine. Israel begins the ground invasion of Gaza. What's your read on what, if anything, the U.S. should do right now in reaction?
Well, with regard to the Ukraine, the key question is, did Putin know about it? I don't believe he did. Did the Russians, or did anybody order this as a direct act which would shoot down an airliner, which would be an atrocity and a war crime and something horrendous? It is a horrible event, but from what we know, it appears to have been the rebels in the Ukraine thinking they were shooting down a supply plane for the Ukrainian army, which would be a legitimate act of war, and having instead massacred 300 people. So I think the key thing out of this now is where we go from here. Does President Putin decide, look, these rebels are out of control, this war is out of control, this secession movement, and I've got to dial it back and pull away from it, and do the Europeans and the Americans drive forward? A lot of folks would like to revive the Cold War. I'm not one of them. But I think the real question now that this tragedy, this horror, is over, is where we go from here. And it's possible we could dial this war back.
When you look at what's going on there, and you couple that with Israel's invasion of Gaza on the same day, a pretty momentous news day on two different but somehow tied together fronts at the same time.
Yeah, I think it is possible, and again, I don't know this, that the Israelis who are contemplating moving into Gaza saw the enormous national and global attention turn to Ukraine, and that what happened, and decided, look, if there's ever a time to move, let's move now. The Israelis have a tough problem on their hands. They've got to decide how far they're going to go in there with the ground troops and degrade the missiles that are in Gaza, and to decapitate the Gaza regime, Hamas. How much that's going to cost, not only in terms of lives, but in terms of the international reputation and the international view of Israel as being sort of the powerful Goliath here, hammering David to pieces. So I think that the hesitancy the Israelis have shown in going in suggests they are fully aware of some of the, if you will, the geopolitical consequences of what they're doing, both in the Arab world and the Arab street and in the Western world, where their support, they need that support, is vital.
Patrick Buchanan with us. Pat Buchanan. Buchanan.org is his website, and the new book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. You were with Nixon, a senior advisor, starting back in January of 1966. Nixon had lost in 60. He lost the gubernatorial election in California in 62. The famous quote, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Political comebacks, political resurrections are not uncommon, but why and what sparked this one for Richard Nixon?
Well, this is an extraordinary comeback. Not only was Nixon defeated and written off, he had written himself off. He was considered a complete political loser, a figure of mockery. And then the Republican Party was wiped out in '64. And Nixon got up off the canvas and came back and patiently began to rebuild the party, campaigning in '66. And then through that year 1968 of assassinations, the Tet Offensive, Johnson resigning basically from office, not running again, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King riots, the Democratic Party coming apart in Chicago, Nixon comes out of the decade as President of the United States and creates something of a Republican dynasty in the White House that controlled the Oval Office for 20 of the next 24 years. It is a startling story. It contains lessons for what the Republican Party should do now, some lessons for them and what they should do now, but also it's a human story of people in politics and in life. No one has been defeated or more down in national politics than Richard Nixon, and yet he winds up in the Oval Office.
The book is The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. Pat Buchanan is your author. I love this this part in the book where you talk about shortly before his announcement that he was going to be running for president in '68, you and Rosemary Woods got together and presented him with an idea.
We recommended that he run for one term because the country was coming apart, and we felt a lot of decisions were going to have to be made that were going to antagonize one group or another, half the country. And we said, that if he announced point blank when he started that the next president should probably serve a single term, given the incredible problems that are going to be on his desk, Nixon rejected it out of hand. And he told me that if I do that, everybody will be out and running for my succession the day I take the oath, and that maybe you should conduct yourself as though it's going to be one term, but it'd be a terrible mistake to announce that. In retrospect, I think he was right. Theodore Roosevelt forever regretted the fact that he said he would only serve one term when he was elected in his own right in 1904. And, of course, he turned the presidency over to William Howard Taft and then wound up running against his own president.
Pat Buchanan with us, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. It's Ronnie and Scott here on WROK. You mentioned after '64, after Goldwater's loss, the party was in pieces. And somehow Nixon took those pieces, put them back together, not just to win the nomination, but to win the presidency in 1968. How did he do it?
Well, one thing that's got to be mentioned is Nixon had an element of luck. I mean, he put the Republican Party together. We got the Goldwater people together early on. I argued with him. I said, this is where the center of gravity of the party is moving. It's moving to the right. If we can get the Nixon center, the regular Republicans, put them together with the Goldwater movement, there's no way a liberal Republican can beat you for the nomination. But after that, we have to get Democrats because the Republican Party was only half the size of the Democratic Party. And the fortunate thing for us that happened, it wasn't good for the Democrats, is that party came apart into three pieces, three giant pieces. George Wallace, at one point, the governor of Alabama, had the support of 21% of the nation in a poll to be president. Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy were tearing the party apart from the left, leaving Johnson and Humphrey and the rest of the center really without sufficient forces to win an election if we could capture enough of those dissident Democrats. And we barely did. I mean, you go back to October, Hubert Humphrey made the greatest comeback, a greater comeback than Harry Truman. He gained 15 points in the month of October and the first week of November, 5 weeks, and almost put us in the history books with Tom Dewey. It would not have been a good place for me to be.
No, probably not, no. The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. Pat Buchanan is the author. I also, I point out, I love the details on the conversation where you suggest one term. You also had another suggestion regarding running mates.
I certainly did. We were down in the polls, after Dr. King was shot, Nixon went to the funeral. And Dr. King, people don't realize, was a very divisive character. And the next poll showed that Humphrey was ahead of us by 5 points, 7 points. And they consistently showed him ahead. And what that meant is we had to get some voters, and we had to get them maybe from Wallace. And the way you get him, we needed someone to fight Wallace on the right while we fought Humphrey in the center. And so I made a recommendation. I said, we're going to have to be bold, Mr. Vice President. And I can think of nothing bolder than putting the hero of bedtime for Bonzo on the ticket. The memo, and that's right there in the memo, and that was Ronald Reagan. And we had a wonderful writing research staff, a very passionate guys, mostly conservatives, and all of us were saying, look, in the last analysis, if we have to do it, we got to put the governor of California, this Ronald Reagan fellow, on the Nixon ticket.
Pat Buchanan with us. The Greatest Comeback is the book. It's Riley and Scott on WROK. They're used all sorts of your notes and Nixon's notes on your notes in the book. There's one in particular that's actually printed in the book about meeting with John Whitaker, who said you should move to the left to attract people in the party. And you said, no, that's not a good idea. And the advice here, if I can read, when it comes to new programs for the people, all the room on the left has been preempted. There is very little running room over there indeed. Before the Republicans can offer a better program for some welfare idea, the program being tried must fail. Is that still good advice for Republicans today?
I think it is. What I told Nixon is, basically, I was arguing about the shape of American politics in 1966, which was, look, the country is moving to a conservative position, rejecting the Great Society, gradually, and it's not working, and the center of gravity of our Republican Party has moved toward Goldwater. He captured the nomination with a tremendous number of delegates, and to go to the left of Lyndon Johnson would have been to forfeit the nomination and open it up to Ronald Reagan, and it would have been to risk the election. I said, a center-right coalition is the winning coalition in this day and age. And that proved to be correct. And I think, as you see the notes that Nixon wrote at the top of that memo, I agree with this basically, and he had something else in there, and I also don't happen to believe in all this liberal crap. You scratch that out.
Pat Buchanan with us here for
on the tapes.
For another minute or two. Pat, today we hear about President Obama. I've heard this phrase all over the place. He's the president Richard Nixon wished he could have been. The executive power, the imperial presidency. Is all that overblown somewhat with Nixon, or is it true?
Sure it is. Obama, changes the date of the Obamacare law. But look, look what Nixon did. Good heavens, in his first term, he went to wreck China and opened it up to the West. He negotiated a strategic arms agreement with the Soviets. Went to Moscow. He saves Israel in the Yom Kippur War. He brings all the troops home from Vietnam and the POWs. I also, let me tell you, you talk about going outside his authority. Richard Nixon was secretly bombing Cambodia. And we knew about it, but he was doing it to protect our guys inside Vietnam, right across that river. And so he, exercised his authority. And what Obama is doing, it seems to me, is the Congress of the United States has got the power of the purse and various other powers to check an executive. But I fault the Republican Congress; they couldn't even defund Obamacare. They tried and failed. And if you don't do that, some of the whining on the part of the Congress and the Republicans, I find, an excuse to cover up why they're not doing what they should be doing.
Pat, I got to ask, being that I've read a bunch of stellar reviews on your book, and, here's this little spoiler alert. The book does end with Nixon being elected, in case you were wondering what happened. But you've got more.
You gave away the ending.
I'm sorry. I hate to do that, but, you've got more in you. This is, only the halfway point of the story.
Well, it is. It's about one-third of the way. Then you would have the first term, which was a gigantic success, when Nixon, at the end of which Nixon was rewarded with a 49-state victory. And as I tell folks, if we hadn't bollocksed up that break-in, we'd have gotten all 50 states. But then you got the second term, which is a complete disaster, which was Watergate all the way from March of 73 to the August of 74, when that helicopter lifted off the lawn, which is the unraveling and the destruction of an administration and the resignation of a president. So, yeah, I'm sort of committed, not officially, but committed to do a book on the Nixon years and the Nixon resignation, and maybe get a couple of chapters on that other president I spent some time in his White House, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Pat Buchanan, The Greatest Comeback is the book. It goes right on my bookshelf next to the other Buchanan books. One other quick question, Pat, because I know when you were running for president, especially in 2000, immigration, illegal immigration, the border, that was a core issue for you and still is. What in the world?
1992,
yeah.
When I ran against George H.W. Bush when he was president of the United States, challenged him. I went to the border in San Diego, and people were walking into our country at the rate of 5,000 a weekend. They'd move through these villages, as it were, just move onto the American side. And I said then, put the National Guard on the border and build a security fence. We're a superpower. You can't have people walking into your country. As Reagan said, a country that can't control its borders isn't really a country anymore. And it is really a failure of America as a nation, both parties, presidents of both parties, that we cannot secure the borders of the United States against an invasion, peaceful though it may be, but that is changing the character and composition and the future of our nation.
One of those guys we wish we had a whole lot more time with. You're going to want to have some time with his book, though, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. Pat Buchanan, thank you so much for your time this morning and continued success with this book and the others that we know you have in you.
Okay, and you say hello to the professor for me.
I sure will.
Thanks, Pat.